What do you think about this counteroffensive? We know in the last 2 months, 46,000 soldiers were killed in this counteroffensive just in 2 months. Yesterday, Wall Street Journal was talking about the next spring counteroffensive. How do you see that?
Well, the counteroffensive was, I think, a complete failure. I think that people know this. They don't want to acknowledge it. Politically, that has implications for those who kept saying the counteroffensive was going to make such a big difference, was going to change the landscape of this war. And it has failed. Ukraine has had no success whatsoever in penetrating the 3 lines of entrenched defenses that Russia has set up. It could barely even get to the first line. Russia is actually even gaining ground in the northeast of Ukraine right now. So reclaiming territory that at one time Ukraine had taken. So this is an utter failure, and it's cost so many lives that it's just inexcusable that this has been pushed. You know, the Ukrainian military was somewhat reluctant, to get into this early on and cautioning against any sort of hopes of great success and what have you, but they were pushed by their own political leadership and as well as by the West to do this. And what the West needed was a Ukrainian victory. Look at the long battle at Bakhmut, which Ukraine fought so long to try to, to win that battle. It lost, just like it did in Mariupol earlier in the war. So Ukraine needed a victory, and the West needed a victory on Ukrainian soil to be able to bring that to the NATO conference in Vilnius a month or so ago. Well, it didn't have that. And now what you've got Ukraine doing, it's taking pot shots at Russia, sending a drone missile to attack a building in the business district of Moscow, or perhaps in the Crimea, on a bridge or what have you. And but those things are nothing. They're not going to make any kind of difference in this war. And so the Ukrainian, this offensive was a failure. And now there's talk about another offensive maybe next year or what have you. These are all just pipe dreams. There's been too much loss, too much destruction of resources. And Ukraine can barely muster the military that it needs right now to hold on to the lines that it has right at this point.
If that's the case, why they're talking about next year counteroffensive? Is that political in your opinion, or what they're talking about?
Yeah, of course it's political. It's the variety of things going on here. The West is deeply invested into this war. The United States alone, like $113 billion, and Joe Biden just asked for another 24. And so they can't have this loss on their watch, particularly Joe Biden, who's running for re-election next year. He's got to keep this thing going at least through the election. Then maybe they can figure something out after that. But there's no really incentive to end this thing. You would think that incentive would come from within Ukraine itself after such losses, and all of these losses, just so Ukraine could be a member of NATO and thus pose a threat to Russia in the coming years. All of these losses for that, and it's not going to gain that. And so, yeah, it's all political, and it's not just Joe Biden; it's the West as well. The leaders of NATO countries have themselves, put themselves on the line in favor of this war, and invested their own country's resources. And so, nobody wants that loss as part of their record, and that's why they're pushing this thing on. And it's really irresponsible and immoral.
How do you see the chance of Ukraine being member of NATO or even the EU?
No, there's no chance whatsoever. I just was learning today that Stoltenberg, NATO, has sent out a message that possibly NATO could accept the current losses of territory in Ukraine, cede those to Russia, if then Russia would agree to allow Ukraine to join NATO. I don't think Russia's going to go along with that at all. I think that I don't even think the United States wants it either, because they want this war to continue on, at least for another year. And so that's the issue you've got there. And so it's political investment all around, and nobody wants a black eye on this whole experience. Although they've already got it, they just haven't acknowledged it.
Do you think the continuation of this war would be a win for Biden's reelection?
I don't think it's a win. I think it's a horrible testament to the utter failure of his foreign program, foreign diplomacy. And I think the American people are sick of this too. I mean, look at what's going on in Hawaii and the island of Maui, and all the destruction from the fires there. And what has Biden done? He's allocated $2.4 million to try to help restore the lives of the residents there who've lost everything. You know, when my gosh, you know, one tank costs multiple times that, and think of all the tanks we've sent to Ukraine. And so the cynicism of of the whole program, in which he keeps pouring money into Ukraine and then depriving Americans of their own needs here. I think more and more people are becoming aware of that. So I think Biden has some political issues beyond his age coming into this next election.
Because the report says that more than 55% of Americans are against sending weapons to Ukraine. Is this administration paying any attention to these polls?
You wonder, but you know what? What's going on here is Donald Trump, for all his problems and what have you, I think was on target when he talked about the deep state in Washington, D.C. There is a deep state that crosses partisan lines. It's both Democrat and Republican. The deep state is very much part of the Biden administration. Victoria Nuland, the Deputy Secretary of State, and others within that administration. These are war hawks. They have a perception of the United States as the one superpower with hegemony, economic as well as political and military hegemony over the world. And they're going to do anything they can to preserve that. You know, they've already got their eyes on China. Once this whole thing with Ukraine, they can move past that. And so, so is Biden paying attention to polls that show that more and more people do not like this war? I don't think I'm not sure those polls even matter in one sense, because there is such determination within his own administration to keep this thing going. And he feels somehow he can pull this out, that, that somehow that what we're doing is saving democracy around the world, when Ukraine is anything but a democracy in a country in which Zelensky's already abolished the opposing parties. He's abolished, there's no free press in Ukraine. So how can you argue we're defending democracy in that country?
We know that the other problem that is in Africa right now is coup that has happened in Niger. What's your take on the problems that we're facing in Africa?
That's really an interesting situation. I'm glad you brought that up. We've got the potential here for another proxy war between United States and the West and Russia, or even China possibly here. In Niger, you've got this military rule has taken over that country, has ousted the former president. But that military rule, unlike most juntas, has the support of the people. There are thousands and thousands of people who've been in the streets of the capital city. They're supporting that junta. Why are they supporting it? Because these generals have essentially told the French neo-colonialists, we don't want you here anymore. Get out of here. In fact, most Americans don't know that the United States actually has a military base in Niger, as do the French. And they both exploited this country for its uranium deposits, as well as other African countries. That's why you have Niger supported by Mali, Burkina Faso, and other countries, which have also had changes in government recently for the same reasons. And so this is very important. You've got a standoff because Niger is tilting toward Russia, possibly tilting toward Russia, looking for support, perhaps even calling in the Wagner troops to come in to help defend itself in case there's an invasion from outside. And so the United States does not want that, and so it wants to preserve it for the West. And you've got a threat of invasion from the so-called ECOWAS countries of Africa. That's the Economic Community of West African States, led by Nigeria, a few other countries. These are countries totally tied to the United States and the West, financially, politically, and otherwise. They've threatened to invade Niger. And Burkina Faso and Mali, and perhaps Guinea have said that we'll support Niger if they do. So you got a potential of a great civil war here. Lots of need for weapons, more for the military industrial complex. Hopefully it's not going to come to that, but these uprisings and political wars and what have you connect to the larger picture of what's going on between the West and the East, and this standoff between the United States and Russia, and even more importantly, ultimately, China.
We know that Victoria Nuland went to Niger to negotiate with these military commanders. How did you find that?
She's the ultimate war hawk. You find her everywhere, where there's a war to be mongered, a war to be had, or money to be made for the military-industrial complex. Yes, she went to Niger, and she got the cold shoulder. She wanted to meet with the former president who's in prison. They refused to allow her to do that, basically invited to leave. Totally no success. While she was there, they warned the new leaders of Niger that they run the risk of antagonizing the West, which they've already done. And so I was glad to see that she was ejected. Part of the reasoning of being articulated by the Biden administration is we don't like coups, we want to serve democracy. When has the United States not liked a coup? Decades ago, our CIA helped overthrow the Allende regime, Allende government in Chile, and to install a horrible dictatorship that lasted for years under Pinochet. Victoria Nuland was in Kiev when the Russian-leaning elected president was kicked out in a coup d'etat and allowed the establishment of a Western-leaning government that now is run by Zelensky. We like coups. We just want the coups to be our people against our enemies.
And the other problem that we are facing, if we look at this Ukraine war, we know that in 2014, in 2015, there were agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. They wanted to solve the situation in Ukraine, but instead of solving the problems, they were buying time for Ukraine building up its military. How it seems to me that the same thing is happening in Taiwan. They're trying to send weapons to Taiwan instead of negotiating with China. Things are getting worse.
It's awful, and there's a lot brewing over there. This is an even larger sort of issue for the neocons in the Biden administration that they're sort of champing at the bit to get to. China, to me, is not a military threat to the United States. It's an economic challenge to the United States because of its growing economic power. And that's why this talk of war and the talk of Taiwan, my gosh, the United States for decades has agreed that Taiwan is a part of mainland China, that it is a part of China. And now all of a sudden, we're talking about possibly going to war to prevent Taiwan from becoming part of China, something we've agreed to for decades. It's bigger than Taiwan. Taiwan could become the next Ukraine, the next battleground where hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese are killed for the sake of Western hegemony over all the world. And as I've said before, does the United States have any more right to be in the South China Sea than China? Nima, right now at this point, while we're talking, there are military exercises taking place in the Pacific from a joint operation of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, targeted at China, just sort of in a threatening way, showing our military prowess, just to show China what may be coming up. What's so foolish about this is under the Biden administration, we've managed to align two of the largest nuclear powers in the world, China and Russia, to align them together. And have we become so arrogant after our wars with smaller countries, our wars that countries did not have the military prowess to take us on, to be able to take on these two giants right now? It's an arrogance that's mind-boggling, actually.
If you remember, Tony Blinken went to China to negotiate with them, and when he came back, Biden right after that called Xi as a dictator.
Yeah,
You know
I
how
mean,
they receive these mixed messages from the Biden administration. They had Kissinger went to China to negotiate. What how do you see the whole situation? These relations between the Biden administration and China.
Xi in China, as well as Vladimir Putin in Russia, know you really can't trust the West. They make an agreement, then they break that agreement. They don't care. You know, Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, admitted the Minsk agreements that were signed in 2015 to sort of foster peace in Ukraine with Russia and what have you, were just a ploy, buy time to build up the Ukrainian military for an eventual conflict with Russia. Such cynicism. And you know, these broken promises that you mentioned go all the way back to well, they go back further than that, but they go back certainly to 1990 during the Clinton administration, when Gorbachev was still the leader of the last leader of the Soviet Union, and said, okay, we're going to allow the reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Eastern Germany, pull all our troops back, as so long as you promise not to expand to the east. And NATO promised not to expand. In fact, NATO didn't even have a reason to exist once the Soviet Union fell. But what did it do? It broke all those promises, expanded all the way up and down the border, the western borders of Russia, until it came to Ukraine. And then Russia finally said, enough is enough. We're not allowing this. Ukraine has a historic connection to Russia that reaches beyond politics. It's cultural. It manifests itself in so many different ways, and there's where Russia drew the line. And I think probably the United States, the deep state, the West, knew that they would and saw war coming, and they didn't care. They thought with their military weapons, and Ukraine, you know, had it when this war started, one of the largest armies in Europe, and they said, well, we can do it. Well, they couldn't do it. This time they took on a major power. This is not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. This is not Grenada. You know, this is not Vietnam. This is Russia, and they don't back off so easily.
As you mentioned, this is the third army in this counteroffensive. We've seen the third army of Ukraine trained by NATO. The first army was defeated by September. Some experts say by September last year. They're insisting on this war, to continue this war as long as, I don't know how long the Biden administration is pretending to continue this war. But I see no desire, no will in this administration to start negotiating with Russia.
You know, I wonder too how much part of this is Joe Biden's own desire not to allow war to end anytime soon until the storm passes over regarding his son and his own relations in Ukraine. You know, Joe Biden was Obama's go-to guy in Ukraine. While he was vice president, that's when his son Hunter got that really lucrative job with the Burisma company with no experience whatsoever in that industry, getting $1 million a year. You don't think his father had a role in that, or somehow at least was an inspiration for them to hire this guy? Who knows what all went on behind the scene in what was then called the most corrupt country in all of Europe and beyond Europe. And so who wants all of that, you know, to investigate it further? I don't know. And then, as I said earlier, there's an immorality to all of this. The cost to the Ukrainian people, they've lost some 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers and others caught in this conflict, as many as 50,000 amputees. How many young men in Ukraine now are missing legs and arms, scarred for the rest of their lives for this conflict? Yet we didn't seem to care when the ruination we left behind in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam. We've allowed the sending of cluster bombs to Ukraine, just like we used them in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. And those bombs are horrible for the damage they do and the damage they leave behind, and for unexploded so-called bomblets that years later that a child could step on or pick up as a toy and then be killed or maimed for life. It's awful. And I believe here in the United States, we've become, and partly the media, We've been so immunized to war. In a sense, war is something distant. We don't feel war. We don't see it in our neighbors and in the destruction around us. I was in Vietnam. I was a Vietnam soldier. After being a war protester, I just didn't want to go to Canada. I ended up going to Vietnam, which a war I was against, but I went and I saw in that country what war can do. The children with missing arms and legs and what have you, and scars, and the destroyed landscape and so forth. It's just terrible. And our media needs to do a better job to portray what the true effects of war are, to bring it home, at least on our screens or into our pages of our newspapers or magazines, to let people know this is not something you want to engage in, even if it's thousands of miles away.
You know, Wall Street Journal reported that the West knew that Ukraine is not sufficiently prepared for this counteroffensive. And right now they're talking about the next counteroffensive. We remember these papers were talking about this counteroffensive since December last year. And for 7 months, 6 months, they were talking about forcing Ukrainians to do this counteroffensive. We know how the media, how these papers are playing a big role in this counteroffensive, in forcing Ukrainians, in pushing them into this counteroffensive. What's your take on the role of media?
Oh my gosh. Just a few days ago, the Telegraph in England had a story headlined about how Russia's weakest spot is in the seas and at sea, that Ukraine, which has no navy to speak of, can somehow defeat Russia in the Black Sea. The Times also reported that Ukraine is actually winning the war. And what drugs are their editors taking to think Ukraine is winning this war? I'm a veteran journalist for nearly 50 years. Worked as a reporter in various newspapers. I was in Washington, D.C. as a congressional correspondent for a number of years. And I've been teaching journalism as well as practicing it for the last 30 years. I have never been so disappointed and just aghast at the kind of coverage we're getting from our mainstream media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Network News, how they are just carrying the water of the policymakers in Washington, D.C., how they're part of the deep state. They are almost as much responsible for the carnage of this war as the policymakers in the Biden administration, because they don't tell the story to the American people. If they did tell the full story, I think you would see more people out on the streets protesting what's going on, and the fact that we're sending billions of dollars into this hopeless cause at the same time that our people have needs of their own. I'll tell you what's going on here. There's a history to this. There was relative freedom in the coverage, journalistic coverage of the Vietnam War. You had correspondents like David Halberstam of the New York Times. At that time, the Times actually was doing some good coverage, reporting on the lies told by the American generals about that war and telling the truth about that war. And what did you have back home? You had protests in the streets against it. Also, you had the draft, and that brought the war home closer to the people, of course. But you had truth being told. You don't get that anymore. The Pentagon, after Vietnam, decided we're never going to have this again. They began to adopt policies to control coverage. And you know what? The media, the mainstream media, was complicit in that and allowing that to happen as they came closer and closer together to sort of defend the status quo in the United States, defend the establishment. Because, you know, the editors of the New York Times, they're top reporters in Washington Post. They went to the same Ivy League schools, the same prep schools as the policymakers in the State Department. And so they're buddies. They go have their lunch together and what have you, and they get fed stories. And those are the stories we read in our papers and see on the evening news. And what they're half-truths. They're not the whole truth. We're not being told the whole truth by our media.
We know that this war in Ukraine hit Europe's economy so hard, and they're experiencing so much difficulties in Europe. And car production reduced by 36% from 2022 to 2023. This is a big part of Europe's economy. And now, beside this conflict in Ukraine, we know that the United States is shifting toward Taiwan and China. Do you think that Europe gonna go along with the United States as they did in Ukraine?
I hope not, but I have to wonder at just the acquiescence of European leaders to American rule over their own lives, the fate of their nations. Um, I'm half German myself. I lived in Germany for a number of years. I studied at the University of Munich. So I remember thinking with sort of admiration, some of the European leaders at that time, back in the 1970s, what have you, how they had their own viewpoints, their own sort of ideas about the world, and weren't so cowed by American dominance. The new generation of leaderships we have over there, I just can't believe it. I mean, Schultz in Germany being silent as the United States, at least according to Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh, blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, which was the major source of energy for Germany, and a major reason for its economic power in Europe. Just allowing that to happen, an act of war essentially against Germany as well against Russia, and not saying anything and just going along with it. There have been other reports since then. It wasn't the Americans, it was Ukrainians. I don't care. It was one or the other. I kind of tilt toward the Americans myself, but I believe Seymour Hersh's story. But just the silence on that. And but you've got what you've also got in Europe is a sort of a Zelensky curse, and other commentators have talked about this. Look at the changes in government since this war began. Turnovers in the British leadership, and in Italy, and in parts of Scandinavia and what have you, more recently in Latvia. There's growing dissatisfaction among the European people with what's going on in that country, the high inflation, high energy prices. And I've talked about this before, these massive demonstrations against Macron in France and elsewhere in Europe. They're part of a larger picture. What we've got here too is a challenge to a growing global challenge to the neoliberal sort of rule of this world, the corporatocracy that the United States is already ruled by, but they would like to impose on the rest of the world, in which it's largely been successful, in which ideally what neoliberalism means is it's a free trade, open borders and what have you. But what it really also means is constant war. It means massive immigration, because that brings cheap labor. It means austerity policies, such as has been practiced by the EU, which is a wing of this neoliberal sort of, or neoconservative, sort of interchangeable terms, the concept. Look at the way they treated Greece and other countries struggling economically, saying, okay, cut your social programs, get rid of your labor unions, cut down on any kind of social net that helps people who are struggling. That's their answer to economic problems. And so it's part of a bigger picture. Riots from immigrants in Europe and what have you aren't totally disconnected from what's going on in Ukraine and the challenges of China. It's a world sort of order that's being challenged on a variety of fronts.
These endless wars are devastating Europe. We know that in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, all these refugees are going to Europe.
Yes.
Most of them. And on the other hand, we have this problem with Ukraine, now with Taiwan. Europe is really in trouble.
We've seen signs already of this, and the challenges to the political leadership in England, Boris Johnson, what have you, in Italy and these other countries. You're going to see more and more of that, because it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. Europe was lucky this past winter. The winter was relatively mild, so they weren't pushed to the edge by really cold temperatures and not having enough oil to heat their apartments. And but who knows next winter? It's going to and it's going to continue. Germany, my gosh, is deindustrializing. This was an industrial giant, but it's deindustrializing to serve American purposes. One of the reasons, even before the war in Ukraine, the United States was very critical of the Nord Stream pipelines, very critical, because it did not like Germany's dependence on Russia. It did not, and not only Germany, but other parts of Europe as well. And it already strongly opposed those pipelines. Even Joe Biden had warned they're coming down, but even before they did come down. And the fact that you have a political leadership over there that's it's been conflicted. You have the Greens in Germany, which are all they're against fossil fuels and what have you, and they want a green environment and what have you. So they didn't like the Russian pipelines either. But what is their alternative? You got to have an alternative in place that's actually going to serve the people, and they didn't have that. And so they've joined with the conservatives, the warmongers, and so you've seen some strange alliances, strange bedfellows among in the politics of Europe as well as the United States.
Do you think Biden would be the nomination of Democratic Party, or they're thinking about another candidate?
Well, the Democratic Party is going to make sure Biden is the candidate unless something happens between now and then. They have already circled their wagons. It's Joe Biden or nobody. They've said there's not going to be any debates. They're going to limit any kind of sort of public exposure that might expose Joe Biden's inability to even carry on a debate at this point. Just the growing questions about his age, about his mental status at this point. And but you've got the powers behind Joe Biden. The Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt. That's a whole different ball game. And I think that has been developing for some time, certainly escalated under Bill Clinton and his sort of policies of triangulation and what have you, to sort of modify earlier Democratic support of labor unions and those kinds of things, where it became more beyond, under the Clintons and beyond, more of a corporate party, just like the Republican Party. And right now, Joe Biden is their guy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is growing in his candidacy. He's getting more and more attention, and he's making a lot of sense to a lot of people, including me. And but does he have a real chance? He may have a chance in preventing Joe Biden from becoming president by taking enough votes away from him that he's going to lose to, probably he's going to be Donald Trump on the Republican side. We'll have to see. But I don't think Kennedy has enough support to really put him in the Oval Office, but I think he can make a difference in this election. And he's saying things that need to be heard, certainly about this war.
If Trump makes this to the office, how do you see his foreign policy? We know that he was surrendered by neocons when he was in office. And
look at what we got going on in American politics right now. You've got Donald Trump, the likely Republican candidate, who's under 4 separate groups of indictments, possibly facing more. You've got Joe Biden, who's still wrestling with issues related to his son, Hunter Biden. A special prosecutor has been appointed. I'm not sure how good that prosecutor is going to be, but there's going to be further investigation into that relationship. And then you've got the House Republicans talking about impeaching Joe Biden because of these Ukrainian financial connections and what have you. What a mess we're going into next November. And what's going on with our politics? I think our politics have been taken over by corporate interest, with the fact that, as I said just before, both parties are now pretty much ruled by Wall Street. You know where they differ? They differ on a sort of special interest issues. The Democratic Party wants to look liberal by supporting LGBT issues, gender issues, racial issues, and what have you. To me, these are just, as important as they are, they hide the fact that at its heart, the Democratic Party is run by Wall Street, and just as the Republican Party is. So you really don't have Main Street interest in either of the major parties. I think there's a growing awareness of this as issues, social issues grow in this country. This country in many ways is not as racially divided as our media and as our politicians would like to have us believe, because black and white, brown, what have you, are sharing some of the same social stress and duress that's spreading across this country. I hope it makes a big difference in the next election, because we're heading for a real circus next November. It's going to be interesting. And then as this war wages on, and then who knows what saber rattling is going to be going on with China between now and then. And what's scary too, is that politicians who get in trouble get desperate, and will some sort of act of desperation lead to some sort of broader conflagration that's going to get us ultimately into a nuclear war. That's really scary. It's not that impossible now, and that somehow the politics of the day will get us into a horrible, horrible war. And I hope that doesn't happen, but I'm worried about it.
Just to wrap up this session, we know that we have RFK Jr., we have Cornel West as well, that he's going to take some votes from Biden. He's really in trouble.
Yeah, Cornel West is a really interesting guy. He makes a lot of sense himself too. And Joe Biden prides himself on the Black electorate and his support that he got, when he ran for presidency. His victory in South Carolina during the primaries was the key point in his successful move toward the final general election. And so that's important to Joe Biden. They've got Cornel West, an African American, who's posing a challenge to him. And then you got Cornel West and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. nipping at his heels, and he doesn't like it. I'll tell you that. Neither does the Democratic Party.